All right. Welcome to Creative Mornings, Charlotte.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Tim Miner, and I just want to make sure to welcome each and every one of you, whether this is your 15th time here or your first time, you're welcome in this room. We embrace the concept of welcoming people. In this room, we want this to be a collection of people that are truly representative of our country and our city. And if you see friends that should be here, invite them, welcome them. We'll find a way to get them in the room. And I want you to also put this up where you can see it and remember that the people that are annoying you and the people that are saying the things that you just hate and the people that put that link to that article, fake news or not, that is driving you insane, they're welcome in this country too.
We're not in the business of creating an echo chamber. We're in the business of starting conversations, and if those conversations can start in here and those conversations can then continue outside of these four walls in ways that are healthy and respectful, that's something. That's something. So that's one of the many reasons why we're here every month with you, and I thank you all so much for being here and continuing to show up. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Welcome to Creative Mornings, Charlotte. Another reason why we're here every month is to hear amazing Charlotte musicians come and share their work with us, and this morning is no exception. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Charlotte's very own Leanna Eden, everyone.
Caught in the headlights of those passing cars. I am you and you are me looking for answers in the dark.
Leanna Eden, everybody, and Patrick. Ladies and gentlemen, here to speak to us on the global theme of Taboo, my friend and Charlotte's very own, Amy Chiou, everybody. Welcome, 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 welcome.
So a few weeks ago, Matt Olin asked me to speak at Creative Mornings. And he said, before you answer, the topic is taboo. And I thought, I'm a terrible choice to talk about sex or religion. What? And he said, well, actually, we were hoping you would talk about politics. I was like, oh, right. And that kind of brings me to my first point about taboos. They're not so much the things that we shouldn't talk about as they really are the things that we don't talk about, right? So because I talk about politics all the time, I forget sometimes that it's not really appropriate, polite conversation in decent company. The things that are taboo, they kind of change, right? Like these days, I feel like everyone wants to talk about politics. I went to the dentist this week, and he found out that I worked on campaigns. So we started this conversation about the last election and the current administration. And I was trying really hard to keep up my end of the conversation while he was filling a cavity. It didn't go really well. I think I was mostly there to listen. But I was sitting there thinking, this is incredible. Like a couple years ago, this would have never happened. We would have talked about like the weather or the Panthers or something else. And just like quick show of hands, how many of you have had a conversation in the last week or so about politics? Wow. That's okay, because I also prepare to talk about sex, just in case. I'm just kidding. That would be completely awful, and you would all be asking for your money back. So I decided I wanted to talk about this morning and then talk about this topic for two reasons. First, I think that when people like Matt and Tim and Steve and the rest of the Creative Mornings crew volunteer their time and energy to create moments of community for us, it's important to appreciate and support them. So for me, this is a gesture of gratitude to all of you. And then also, based on that show of hands, a lot of us trying to have conversations about politics these days, but I don't think they're going very well, right? I think people are like typing these clever tweets and then firing them off at strangers, right? Or they're reposting, like, oh my gosh, the reposting, I think it's getting a little out of control, right? I think my Facebook algorithm's all messed up. And And then I think we're kind of Googling, right? Like people are like, did you know that so-and-so's our representative? And I'm like, yes, I did, right? And they're like, how does this government thing work? I think we're building these little fortresses with our research, and then we're firing off the facts that we've collected at people that disagree with us as if maybe they're weapons. Y'all, that's just not sustainable at all, right? Like, we've got to figure out a way to get past that, and we have to figure out how to take our political conversations and have them in such a way so that they're productive and constructive and kind. I think that's really important. So I've been involved in politics for about 15 years. That's about half my life. I've been a volunteer, I've been a campaign staffer, and I've been an advisor and a citizen. And so for me, I define politics as the process of distributing resources and navigating systems with influence, power, and diplomacy. You're not gonna find that written out anywhere. That's kind of like the murkiness behind politics, right? It's not stuff that we're really up and open about, but it's all stuff that matters. And in the last 15 years, I've seen dozens of candidates and elected officials. We've had lots of conversations with supporters, opponents, protesters these days. And so I've been part of a lot of really hard conversations. But actually, my experience with tough conversations goes a little further back than that. I'm the child of 2 immigrants. My parents moved here in the 70s for graduate school. And then because of generous immigration policies that are actually kind of vulnerable these days, they were able to stay and raise a family and contribute meaningfully. In fact, if any of you have ever had a cell phone call that lasted 30 minutes and didn't drop the call, you're the beneficiary of some of the technology that my dad created. But you know, as almost every child of immigrants has to do, we navigate a lot of adult social situations for our parents. And as a child, they're like awkwardly political in a whole different way, right? You have to explain things like what's prom, why they have to meet in conference with their teachers. And it starts really early, right? Because there's like this language barrier too, right? So when I was 5 years old, we moved from a suburb of Dallas to like a newer suburb of Dallas. And my mom usually went to work early, and so it was usually my dad's job to take me to school. And so on the first day of a brand new school, my dad takes me to school. Now, English is not his first, second, or even third language, right? And so today, I mean, back then and now, it's pretty terrible. And so the teacher talked to my dad for 10 minutes, and she assumed that I also couldn't speak English. And so they put me in the 3-year-old class so I could learn how to speak English. Now, I couldn't really convince anyone that I didn't belong there, right? It's a new school. I don't know what's going on, and I'm 5. So I go to my class. We figured it out by the end of the week, right? I was teaching the other kids how to tie their shoes and write their names. And they were like, oh, okay, this kid needs to go somewhere else. But that's kind of the beginning of when I learned that the systems that we build are only as good as the people who manage them and the information that they have to work with. And so for me, that's also the beginning of when I became an advocate. Because at its simplest form, advocacy to me is making sure that the system has the information it needs to work as well as it can for as many as it can. So then I was thinking, right, for this talk, about all the hard conversations that I've had. And they're all really uncomfortable and really awkward, right? So I started to think about it, like, I don't like them because I don't like feeling uncomfortable. I don't like making other people feel uncomfortable. And I thought, well, what about them is so uncomfortable, right? And so for me, every uncomfortable topic has 3 things in common. They're complicated, they're personal, and they're very, very important, right? And that, I think, sums up why political conversation is just extraordinarily difficult. It's always complicated, it's deeply personal, and it's always very important, right? Those aren't things that don't matter. Let's unpack that a little bit. They're complicated, right? If there were an obvious right or wrong, like a really obvious right or wrong, not one that we just feel really strongly about, we probably wouldn't even need to have a conversation about it, right? Because we would just know what to do, and then we would do it. I don't think most people who are involved in politics don't do the right thing or the obvious thing or the easy thing whenever it's possible. There's just not a lot of those situations. What I've noticed in the last 15 years is what makes political conversations extra complicated is that in politics, and sometimes in other situations too, but especially in politics, there are 2 different kinds of truth. And I'm not talking about alternative facts, but there are 2 different kinds of truth. And what I mean by that is there are truths that are based in facts, and then there are truths that are based in feelings. And for example, if I were to say, this is the biggest Creative Mornings crowd ever, there's got to be 1.5 million people here. That's a fact-based truth, right? So it can be disputed, it can be fact-checked, and it can be refuted, right? We like those kinds of facts. We like to be able to Google and measure and count so that I can say I'm right and you're wrong, right? So those are the facts that we tend to talk about a lot in politics. But that's kind of just cover for what really we should be talking about. So for example, if I said, I can't believe how many people are here. It feels like 1 million people are watching me right now. Now what do you do, right? You could question my judgment, but you can't really, challenge or change how I feel right now, that there's all these people looking at me, right? And what I've learned is that in all of our political conversations, whether we call them values or convictions or morals, it's those feelings-based truths, those personal truths that are at the core of every hard political conversation I've ever had. So in 2008, I worked for Hillary Clinton. I was part of her communications team, and I worked out of her headquarters office in DC. And as part of staff, especially junior staff, one of the things that we had to do is we had to answer incoming calls. Now, every campaign phone banks, right? So you have volunteers, they make hundreds of outgoing calls. But those calls are in theory, they're targeted, they're Democrats or Republicans, and we know who's on the other end of the line, and we try to make them friendly. Incoming calls are totally different. You never know who's gonna find the 1-800 number and then decide to give you a call. Right, and so one day I'm in the phone room and I answer a call, and it's this woman. She wants to talk about universal health care, right? Now this is years before we passed the Affordable Care Act. I don't even think it was called that yet. And she was worried about universal health care because she thought if we passed it, it would change how hospitals and insurance companies would pay doctors. And her husband was a doctor. And she was worried that with the change in payments, they would have less income and they wouldn't be able to make their mortgage payments. First of all, that is so complicated, right? This is possible legislation, unplanned implementation, and then a potential change in financials impact, right? And she was already worried enough to call, right? So I started to talk to her about federal, state, and local programs that offer financial assistance for people who are struggling to pay their mortgages. And she interrupts me and she says, well, yeah, but those are for people's first homes. And it turns out that she's worried about the mortgage payment of her beach house. But what struck me is that I spent 20 minutes on the phone with her, and I couldn't tell the difference between the worry in her voice about her beach house and the people that I had talked to that were worried about their health care or their first house or their lack of a house in general, right? Like the intensity and the reality with which she felt vulnerable and insecure was so real. And that's what makes policy so difficult. We're managing millions of personal truths at any moment. Right? And then hard conversations for me are always personal, right? There's not a public policy that doesn't affect someone directly and personally. So I used to host this happy hour with a Republican friend of mine. I would bring the liberals, he would bring his conservative friends, and we would debate. There was no topic that was off limits. And the rule was that you had to use arguments. And if you resorted to name calling, we would ring this bell and you'd have to take a shot. It was a lot of fun while it lasted. And one night, we were talking about a woman's right to choose. Choice is always a hot topic, right? So things started getting tense. And someone says, this is why I hate talking about social issues. People always take it so personally. And it got real quiet. And my friend grabbed his hand and she put it on her stomach and she said, it is personal because sometimes a woman's right to choose and access to an abortion means that a woman like me doesn't have to carry to term a baby who no longer has a heartbeat. I learned more about choice that night than I had in years of Democratic politics because it is always personal, and it's important that we remember that when we're arguing over these things, that these things matter very deeply to a people, even if they don't necessarily directly impact you, right? Like gay marriage is about who we love and how we honor that publicly and legally. Healthcare isn't really about payments and premiums. It's about access to medicine and doctors, and sometimes that literally is the difference between life and death. And when you think about quality public education, not so much whether it exists, but how it's distributed, That's the difference between a prison cell and a profession for so many children in America. So even if you don't think that it matters to you in your life, it matters to someone, and it's always personal. And then, gosh, politics they're all important subjects, right? Like, it's easy to talk about the Panthers or who's going to get a rose on The Bachelor on Monday, right? Because at the end of the day, that stuff doesn't matter, really doesn't. But whether your tap water is safe to drink, that's important. And whether you can walk around your neighborhood safely, that's important, right? How quickly does somebody come when you call 911? Something we don't really think about, but that's really important. These things are all also local, by the way, and we have elections this fall. But these things are the things that we really need to be talking about. And I think there are things that we need, right? Like, we need someone to show up when we call 911. And that's what makes them hard, right? Because they make us feel vulnerable when we need something from someone that we don't even really know. And then when we're depending on systems that we don't really have control over, that's also really scary. But I think that's what government and politics really is, right? It's about how do we coexist and how do we kind of organize and manage the ways that we're dependent on each other for survival and for thriving and for success. And so for me, all of these really hard conversations, right? They're complicated, they're personal, and they're really important. And I've had a lot of them, right? Whether you talk to donors or whether there's all sorts of people that would call a campaign office, right? They're looking for a job, they're looking for help. But it's only recently that I learned that there's kind of an art to having these conversations. So a few months ago, a friend of mine introduced me to someone who's interested in running for office. This happens all the time. So I have coffee with this person, and at the end of our coffee, I call my friend, and I'm like, I don't understand what just happened. I don't think they're ready at all. My friend goes, oh yeah, I completely agree. I just knew that you would deliver that better than I would. And I was like, what? You just outsourced truth-telling. And he said, well, yeah, but you're just so much better at being honest without being soul-crushing. He's like, why do you think I gave you a hashtag? Right? So the same friend, right, after a particularly honest conversation, he created hashtag, you've been chewed. And anytime I tell someone the truth, they call them hard truths, right, about their odds of political success or, what's wrong, really. My friends all use it now. They kind of just sprinkle it in our conversation, you've been chewed. And there's someone in here that can vouch for that, so I'm not making this up. And I was thinking about that, how ridiculous is it that we're so uncomfortable telling someone your opinion, right? That's just a personal truth. That person can go out there and get other opinions and kind of diminish the impact of that. But it was just such a tough thing to say out loud, I don't think you're ready. It wasn't even I don't think you're good, right? Or I don't think you should run for office. It was just I don't think you're ready. And I was thinking, the thing is, how is anything going to get better if we continue to outsource it and dodge our truth-telling? We've got to figure out a way to get comfortable with being a little uncomfortable, if for no other reason than our country depends on it, right? And so I'm going to share a couple of things that, for me, make hard conversations a little easier. There are 5 things that I always try to do. First, I try to understand what's going on, right? I want to know who you are, what matters to you, what brought you to a conversation with me. And then I share the same thing, right? I provide context so that we can build trust and we can kind of share common ground. I tell you what matters to me. I tell you what I care about in terms of a big picture and then little things, right? I tell you why I care about politics, usually, if it's a political conversation. And I just tell you the truth, then I let it go. I try to be quick and direct about it because there's enough complicated things in the world. And if it's unclear what I was saying, you're just going to walk away being like, I don't know what just happened. But I let it go, and I think that's really important. When you give out advice, people may or may not take it, and it might take some time for them to take it. So I just give it to you, and now it's yours, right? You do whatever you want with it. I don't take it personally, and I just let it go. And if there's something really big that we disagree on, I try to figure out what it is. And I think it's important that we figure out how to tolerate that disagreement. So I identify it, I define it, and then I set it over here so we can focus on the things that we do agree about. And that's the last thing. I like to focus on shared goals. I think it's really important. And so I'll tell you a story to kind of sum it up. This is probably the hardest political conversation I've ever had with a candidate. It was about updating their look, right? That's pretty personal. It was really awkward, and this person was my boss, right? So we had heard from several supporters that maybe their look could use a little update. And we kind of agreed, right? And so the team decided that I should be the one to have that conversation. And just so we're clear, I was on the fundraising team. That was totally outside of my job description, right? So I schedule a meeting, and I sit down with the candidate, and I say, so tell me again why you decided to run for office. And so they start talking about what they believe in and how it's time for new leadership, new perspective, and a new vision, right? That was our tagline. And I said, well, I believe in all those things too, and I believe that you can win. And I said, so tell me about these glasses that you wear. And the candidate says, well, yeah, I've had them forever. And I was like, I know. And I think they're inconsistent with our message of new leadership and new perspective and new vision. And he was like, okay. And by the end of the week, we had new glasses, we had an updated wardrobe, and we won that fall. I'm not saying that new glasses will win you an election, but I'm also not saying that they won't. Now, it's important to note that these things don't have to go in order, right? Sometimes you listen first, sometimes you talk first. And they don't have to happen in one conversation, right? You can build trust over time by showing up consistently. You can earn a reputation for telling the truth, and then you can start there. And then shared goals will carry you so far, right? People join campaigns for the shared goals, and then sometimes we create campaigns around shared goals. But I think the hardest of these is learning to tolerate disagreement. And I find that it's easier when I remember that the foundation of their positions are rooted in things that are complicated and personal and important. And that just because I disagree doesn't mean that I can question the intensity with which they feel their personal truths. Now, I'll tell you, I have a lot of personal experience with learning to tolerate disagreement. For the longest time, I didn't tell my parents that I was involved in politics, partly because it was really difficult to explain American politics in Chinese. And then partly because I was supposed to be studying and not wasting time, right? So regardless, I just didn't say anything. And then in 2008, Hillary was giving a speech in DC, and they asked me to stand on stage behind her and hold a sign. You know the look, right? Like, it's a rainbow of people standing behind a candidate while they talk. So at the end of the event, I get out and I check my phone, and I have 3 text messages from my mom. Your godmother called. She saw you on C-SPAN. Are you a Democrat? And I was like, what? Because that was that same moment that I learned that my parents were, in fact, Republicans. And not just any kind, right? Like, I had registered in the vote, right? Like, I was a voter registration person in high school, and I came home, and I was like, Mom and Dad, you should register to vote. You've been here forever. And so they did, and apparently they registered as Republicans, and they are what we call AAA Republicans, right? They're the kind that vote in every election. And you know what? That's what we have in common, right? We never miss an election. And since then, I have been politely kicked out of our living room for shouting at their governor. And I have equally politely excused myself when they were fussing at my president. And then when Hillary announced that she was going to run again, my dad calls me and he says, are you doing Hillary 2016? I was like, I don't know, Dad. She announced last week. It's kind of early to make a decision. And he says, okay, well, just remember, you can't eat hope and change for dinner. And the thing is, yeah, we just don't talk about it very often, but I call them all the time. I see them every holiday, and we just politely agree that we're not going to talk about politics other than, as it relates to the job that I'm doing. And so I think it's possible to tolerate a disagreement and coexist with people and just kind of work on the other things that matter to you, right? And I'm going to close today with 2 asks. First, I'm going to ask you to dig deep and figure it out where it is that you stand on these issues that pique your interest, right? So like everyone's drawn to different interests for different reasons. And I think we're really good at understanding like the surface level, but sometimes we don't go past that to understand why is it that we've connected with this issue. So I encourage you to write down what it is that matters to you, right? Be specific and be personal about how these sorts of issues impact your life. And then figure out what makes it so complicated, right? Is it the funding model? Is it a really wonky distribution mechanism? And the reason I think you should do this is because The better you understand the issue and your relationship with the issue, the better you can be part of a conversation around solutions. And not so much winning over one person or another, right? If you know where you stand and you can figure out where someone else stands, then you can figure out how far apart you are and the distance you have to cover. And it's easier when you know these things to have those conversations without feeling vulnerable and insecure. And then the other thing I'm going to ask you to do is just practice. I mean, you can do this in your car, you can do this in your bathroom, but practice saying out loud some of those personal truths that are based in feelings, right? Those are the harder things to say out loud. And they aren't all big, like, I'm uncomfortable with the moral complications around the death penalty. Sometimes they're really small, like, I don't feel like having Italian tonight, which is actually harder than you think to say, right, when you're in the beginning of a new relationship. And then I would say it's important when you have the opportunity to say the really big ones, you should seize them, right? Like, I love you, and I'm afraid of losing you. So don't avoid the opportunities to have those tough conversations, because it does get easier and you get better with practice. And then as we have those conversations, we can slowly shift our political discourse towards a conversation that is productive and constructive. And that's the only way we'll ever move anything forward. So thank you. Thank you so much for your time.